So yeah, I just wanted to thank. Good, we're going through progress. All right, so I just wanted to let everyone know I'm not going to be checking chat while I'm talking because I get distracted. But feel free to put questions in the chat, and I'll look at them at the end, or obviously email me. And since we're recording this, if anyone's seeing this 7 years from now, please feel free to email me. I'd love to talk about these issues. So yeah, what I want to talk about today is sort of an interesting curiosity in social programs and welfare in the United States around food and what it has to do with food ethics. So for context, let me make sure I can see the screen. There we go. For context, most of you probably know something along these lines, or at least suspect that it's true. The United States gives very little aid in terms of social spending and welfare aid for people. By the way, the charts for this study are about 10 years old, and the reason why is, first of all, because this year, all of the same data will come out for 2023, but also I wanted to make sure that we're skipping over COVID, which had some weird, unlikely uniqueness. So in general, we spend very little, as you can see here. You might think, well, I mean, that's bad, but we're beating Canada, and that's what matters. But in fact, it's worse than that, because for most countries, as spending per capita, just in terms of consumption, goes up, more social spending also goes up, partly just for egalitarian reasons. Quality of life in an economic measure is increasing. So in order to bring people up to that level, you have to spend more. And also means there's more disposable income. The USA, as you can see there, that little red dot is very much an outlier from this general trend. And when you put this together and look at public spending, in this case for families, as a percentage of GDP, we are in fact dead last, and Canada is beating us. Unfortunately. Now, that's true for most kinds of social spending. In fact, almost everything in terms of healthcare. And to be clear, government spending on healthcare, people in the United States as individuals spend more on healthcare than anybody else. Housing, unemployment insurance, anything like that, except food. So the United States is unique among developed nations in giving a ton of aid directly for food to people. These are just some of the federal programs. Most of these federal programs pass through to the state and are administered by the state. And then the state has their own, each individual state in the United States has their own supplementary programs, or they use this to fund their own version of things. But as you can see here, there's money for low-income people, there's money for children to have food in schools, and then also food during summer vacation. There's money for the elderly to have food. There's money for women, infants, and children to have food. So, that's weird, right? We give a lot of money. I don't know. The only other program I know about this at all, and feel free to tell me in Q&A if I'm missing some, is in Norway. There's a temporary card that you can get to buy groceries, but that's just until your public benefits come online. So it's seen as a temporary stopgap. In most other countries, aid is given, and they assume that a lot of that aid is going to food, but it isn't aid that can only be used for food. So whereas in the United States, we will either directly give physical food to people, or we will give them money that can only be spent at certain grocery stores or on certain food products. So there are a few different possible explanations that I see sort of floating around the discourse. Everybody assumes that their explanation is the only one. One of them is supporting farmers. So the idea here is that actually this aid isn't to support poor people. America continues to lag behind the rest of the world in that regard, but we give quite a lot of support to farmers by giving money for people to buy food, or by the US government buying the food and then distributing it. One reason why that might happen is politics. So that argument takes a few different forms. Sometimes people will say, well, historically, it was the case that a very large percentage of Americans were farmers or worked on farms. And so, just as a political reality, you want to help them because it helps most Americans, or because, they have a lot of political power. The modern version of that would be that if you live, just by some curiosities in the US political system, if you live in a very rural, low populated area like farmers do, or then you have a very outsized influence on the US Senate. And so bills tend to favor them. Another version of that that's more sort of holistic, political, economic kind of take is, for the first few hundred years in the United States, there were many food riots. You had these sort of two irreconcilable factions, people that produce food, where they want as high a price for their commodities as possible. And if it drops down, then there's massive poverty and starvation, even though they're farmers, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, people who don't produce any of their own food. and they only have a salary, so they're dependent on low prices for that commodity, as low as possible. And if it goes up, then they're unable to feed themselves. So there was many food riots in the United States. We have a long history of that. And the way to kind of square that circle is the government said, okay, we'll buy that food at an inflated price to keep producers happy, and then we'll distribute it and get rid of it in various ways. I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm focusing on domestic policy, but all of this, everything I'm saying is exactly the same if you just port it over to the lack of international aid, the very low percentage of aid we give to other countries, but we give quite a lot of food to other countries and so on. Another version of this support for farmers is less about political realities and more just about the role that farmers play in the American psyche. This idea that since Thomas Jefferson, at least, that we are a nation of farmers, or that farmers are the best citizens of the United States, or that it's the heartland of America. And so we ought to support them as much as possible. And in fact, the agrarianism in the United States is the reason why I'm saying farmers here, where, of course, you should read all of this to also refer to ranchers, the fishing industry, and even distribution organizations like grocery stores. And so the idea is that maybe we're supporting all of the producers and distributors rather than these impoverished consumers. Another possible explanation is moral demand. So the idea is that starving people have some kind of special moral demand placed on us that we are responding to in a way that we don't to people who are unhoused or people that can't afford their medical bills. So, it's possible in one sense, people are very vulnerable to a lack of food. It has, as I'm sure you guys all know, very profound long-term effects on the rest of someone's life if they were severely malnourished as children, for example. When people are unable to get food, it's very difficult for them to pursue sort of any other goods they might have, like applying for jobs or, dealing with their own health. So there's a real vulnerability, and, just sound a little Levinasian, just the face of starving people might have more of a pull as that shared vulnerability. Another reason why that might be, of course, that everybody eats. So we've all experienced hunger and a worry about getting food. For most of us, it's the hunger of one missed meal because we're traveling or we're busy or there's nothing that you can eat at the philosophy conference. And the thinking about making sure you can achieve the food is something that you definitely can afford. It's just a logistical problem. But it's still the case that we've had to make those kinds of decisions when we've had those kinds of problems. We've felt hunger in a way that middle class and upper class people in the United States have not felt the value of their shelter. They've never been trapped outside, perhaps, and have to sleep on the park for many of us, or being unable to see a doctor under any circumstances. So a third kind of explanation is the title of the talk, right? So the idea is that we'll provide nutritious food and we'll do it for good people. So the good people idea has kind of two elements, which is finding good people and making good people. So for finding good people, we want to find people that need food in these policies, right? We're trying to, we're only giving food benefits because we're only trying to find these people that are truly experiencing hunger, perhaps because of a moral demand. Whereas if we just gave financial support, then we don't know that these people needed food, right? It's maybe they were, maybe they could have afforded food and they're going to use this money for something else, or something, perhaps even something bad, as I'll get to. So we need to find the people that are actually truly hungry, and we also have to find people that deserve this food, right? So the idea is that in many of these policies, there's a lot made of whether or not they need the food because of choices that they made or because of bad luck that we could imagine happening to anybody. And that they'll be on this program only temporarily because they're the good kind of person who will just use it as a temporary stopgap and then they can move on, right? So by giving direct food support, you're sort of like making a very, very low basic social safety net to not fully crash on the ground in a temporary setback. And then for the idea of shaping people, making them good, right? One way that we do that with these policies, as you'll see, I'm going to go through some specific examples, is that we try to shape their health, right? So the idea is we give people good food. We don't just give them carte blanche to buy whatever kind of food they want, the way they would have with cash, or indeed to buy things that aren't food, cigarettes, alcohol, things like that. But this way, we're making sure that they are buying nutritionally complete food, which, goes back to making sure it's something that they need, and, gives them, the long-term kind of health benefits that children, for example, can have from nutritious, balanced meals. And then maybe it'll improve their diets moving forward. So when they no longer need the support and the social safety net, now they've learned how to eat better food. And then the other element of that is shaping character. So not only making them good people in the sense of healthy people, but making them good people in the sense of good people, right? Making them make good choices with their lives, teaching them how to plan better for the future so that they don't need social support, teaching them, how to be better parents, for example. We'll look at some of these examples, but basically shaping who they are so that they're deserving. So let me look at a specific example. This is one of those federal programs I showed you, WIC, which is Women, Infants, and Children. So it's food aid that's in the form of, nowadays, like a credit card that you can use to purchase WIC eligible foods at the grocery store. So if you go to most grocery stores in the United States and you walk around, you'll see that it'll say WIC approved or WIC accepted next to baby bottles, bottles of baby food or peanut butter or milk, possibly soy milk. For vegans, you have to look very hard, or for people that are lactose intolerant, to find the one carton of soy milk that is WIC approved, those sorts of choices. So this program, I think, is pretty obvious what the moral demand is. Young children that don't have enough food place a strong moral demand on us. Just in the sense of thinking of starving children is like a big ethical hit to our sense of who we are as a country and our sense of what we ought to do. But also, we know that malnutrition, just not enough food, not enough calories, has terrible long-term effects in utero. That's why pregnant women are including the women, infants, and children, for breastfeeding, which we valorize very much in our country. Makes it more difficult if women aren't getting enough food and if they're not getting the right kinds of food. And for young children, for the rest of their lives, as I was saying, there's quite a toll if they don't get good food early. So the moral demand seems pretty clear, but also there's a lot of good food for good people. So we make sure that it's people that need it. There's a strong income requirement for WIC. This isn't just part of a baby bundle package like you might have in Northern Europe for everyone who has a child, but rather you have to be low income enough that you qualify for WIC. It's also people that deserve it. Some of that is sort of automatic because you are pregnant and low income, but also there's quite a large hurdle, and this is a very common problem in the United States for social benefits, that qualifying for WIC requires filling out many, many forms, coming to multiple kinds of meetings, some of which I'll talk about in a second. But having the time to do that and the transportation to do that in our car-centric culture, that you really put in the effort to show that you qualify for WIC is part of showing that you really deserve it. And it's used to shape health, right? What you can purchase with WIC is highly restrictive. It's very, we'll talk about how much sense it makes nutritionally, but you certainly can't purchase junk food, high calorie, low nutritive value food, but rather you buy high protein products like peanut butter and like milk. You can buy food for your child, baby food, things like that, and things that are known to have, to help women who are breastfeeding or women who are pregnant. They also, part of WIC is nutritional education. So in order to qualify for WIC, you have to go to these education sessions. How many they are and how onerous they are actually depends state by state, which is another common thing you'll see when we talk about social aid in the United States. It's very state dependent. But you have to go to these, and they have these little handouts. I found one online here that I wanted to point out, the image here on the right. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the one that was from when my wife was on WIC with our first child. That one said, it was a fact, a Q&A, and one of the questions was, I've heard that there's mercury in fish. Should I eat fish as a pregnant woman or as a nursing mother? And underneath it said, it's okay to eat fish in moderation. There's been no study that shows that a small quantity of fish is dangerous. And then several questions later, they didn't have the gall to put them right next to each other. There's a question that said, I've heard it might be bad for my child if I drink alcohol. Can I drink alcohol? And it'll say, no, you should not drink any alcohol while you're pregnant or nursing. There's been no study showing that even a small amount of alcohol is safe. So I love that chart. I used it in my critical thinking class when I was a graduate student, and, where the burden of proof is shifting there. I couldn't find that one online for this presentation, but you do see here that it says, for example, that caffeine can pass into breast milk. That's bad for the baby. So limit how much of the food you eat or drink. Down at the bottom, eating fish safely. Fish is good for you, but it might contain chemicals, might have mercury in it. So don't have too much of it. And then in the middle paragraph that I highlighted, it says, do not drink alcohol or use street drugs. You guys are probably familiar with this, but actually it has not been shown that drinking a very minor amount of alcohol, especially if you're not about to breastfeed, or if you pump and dump, as some people say, actually doesn't have negative effects. But America is a very puritanical, anti-alcohol culture. We drink a lot, but we also feel bad about it. So this is part of that health education and the shaping of the character, right? So only bad people would drink alcohol. You're endangering your child for selfish reasons in a way that apparently is not the case for caffeine or mercury in fish. So we are teaching you how to be a good mother, how to make healthier choices, and how to make less selfish choices, right? In terms of supporting farmers, this is a little de-emphasized in this particular example. We're mostly concentrating on women and their children, but it is the case. It is odd how much WIC emphasizes, from a non-American standpoint, how much WIC emphasizes peanut butter and peanuts. Partly that is because Katie Kendig is here, so she can talk to you about the importance of peanut farming in the United States, and just the way that is sort of built into what for an American would be an answer to a question of protein. But it's a direct subsidy and support from the government, if you think about it, for peanut farming. Also for the dairy industry, you can always buy cow's milk on this program. It wasn't the case that you could buy almond milk or oat milk or soy milk for quite a long time. Then they added soy milk first, again, because of powerful lobbying interests for agricultural soy production. Another example is SNAP. SNAP is just what used to be called food stamps. So it's, again, a credit card that you can use EBT to directly purchase food at a grocery store. It can be spent on a wider range of things than WIC, but still you can only spend it. We'll talk about some limitations on it, and you can only spend it at grocery stores, only for food. You can't buy a t-shirt at a grocery store with SNAP. Again, moral demand, people that can't feed themselves, and especially you'll see a lot of rhetoric about people not being able to feed their family. So again, we're bringing children into this. It's people that are starving. It's people that need this food. And again, a lot of sort of shaping of good food for good people. So as you can see here, for eligibility requirements, we only want to give SNAP benefits for people that are far below the poverty line, COVID being an exception. Things were bumped up, but the general default is that only when you are making very little money, so about according to this one, so it's state by state, about $1,500 for one person, and then an extra $500 to $600 income is allowed for each other member of your family, or each other dependent living with you. So we want people that only really, really need it, and people that deserve it. So again, this is state by state, but I know that at least in Texas, where I am, the ability of former felons, so people that were convicted of felonies and served prison time, to use SNAP is like a political football in the Texas State Senate. At first, they were not allowed to use it at all, and then some felons, if they had nonviolent felonies, could use it. But so again, we don't want to give food benefits to people that served out their prison time and were released. We think that they ought to starve, right? So again, it's about dessert, right? So whether people deserve the food. And there is still a shaping health component. Like I said, much less than WIC, partly because you're an adult, so maybe it has less. Maybe there's a good reason that has less sort of long-term effects than it would on a young child being malnourished. Also, just the extent to our society that thinks that pregnant women are sort of an incubator for the future generations, and we can boss how their health, what health choices they make and how they treat their bodies much more than autonomous people, full humans maybe. So there's less of it, but there are still some elements of shaping health. For example, should SNAP be able to purchase soda is, again, a political football here in the state of Texas. There have been multiple bills introduced to say that we won't allow people to use SNAP to purchase sugary drinks or energy drinks that are listed as like nutritional supplements, that kind of thing. And for shaping character, it's quite interesting that for SNAP, you can't use it to purchase hot food. So a rotisserie chicken, for example, you can't purchase that with SNAP benefits. And if you look at the reasoning behind that for politicians, they'll say it's because you should cook. You should learn how to cook, and you should cook food for your family. Obviously that is a problem for some of the people, quite a lot of the people that need SNAP benefits who themselves don't have access to a full kitchen. So pre-prepared cooked food would be very helpful for them, perhaps. And this one is very directly supporting farmers. So, and farmers defined, again, very broadly to include ranchers and fishers and grocery stores. This is part of the food bill. It's a way to directly subsidize food production in the United States and distribution centers like grocery stores. In fact, there's quite a lot of rules about whether or not you can, what counts as SNAP eligible. Another element I'd actually like to mention for shaping character and shaping health, if you look at the poster that I have there, we have what are called double up food bucks. So if you use your SNAP benefits to buy locally produced food from a farmer's market, that food is more expensive, but it's seen as healthier by many people. It's seen as a thing that good people do, and it more directly supports your local farmers. Many states have in place a double up program. So $5 at SNAP on your SNAP card, on your EBT card that you would use at a grocery store becomes $10 at the farmer's market. All right, and then the last example that I'll talk about is free and reduced school lunches in the United States. It is the case that if you go to public school, for most children, well, as you can see here from the studies here, for quite a lot of the children, you have to pay for the food yourself. That's the default. So there's a cafeteria, you buy the food, or your parents give some money in advance and they get like a card that the child will use, or the parents give money in advance at the beginning of the semester and they have like a name and an account, and the person distributing the food will keep track of which children they are and how often they've eaten. However, you can qualify based on income for a reduced price so that it's a little bit less expensive, or for it to be entirely free if you are low enough income, or if you live in an area where enough students qualify for free lunches. It's just considered to be too much of a bureaucratic pain to check for like the 3 students who should be paying at that school. And so the entire school qualifies, an entire school district will qualify for free lunches. And there are a lot of stories about, if you look online, about children who got in trouble because they don't have enough money to pay for their food, either in their account or with them. It's a real problem for schools. One solution that I've heard of in Texas is you'll get like you'll get lunch because they do want to feed children, right? They do feel they have a duty to feed children, but again, this moral demand of hungry children crying in your school because they haven't eaten since 7 a.m. when you drop them off. But it won't be good. It'll just be a peanut butter and jelly sandwich rather than the full cafeteria lunch. Another very common one is to give the child food, but they start to accrue debt, and the parent has to pay that debt off. An accumulated debt can lead to all sorts of problems, like the child not qualifying for sports or after school activities. It can lead to debt collection against the parents. It can even lead to Child Protective Services calls. So the idea is you're probably a bad parent if you aren't, if you're accruing debt for their child's lunch. You can see, again, how this is shaping people, right? You want to make sure that people need the food, so you have to qualify based on income, even though it's quite onerous to figure out who qualifies for this. Anyone who's filled this out will tell you that it's when you enroll your child or at the start of each school year, you have to provide quite a lot of information just that can be difficult to get, like the income of everybody in your household, social security numbers for people in your household in some places, which is a problem if you don't have documentation. And you have to provide all of that as you sign your kid up so that we know if they qualify for these lunches, because that's more important. People's Policy Project has done some good work on this, which points out how odd that is, given that everything else in school is free, right? So they don't charge for toilet paper, they don't charge for school buses, they don't charge for football equipment for children that are playing football after school, but they do charge for food. And part of that is, again, we want to make sure that it's people that need it, people that deserve it, and we're trying, and there's that moral demand of food. In terms of shaping health and shaping character, of course, a lot of noise happens around what we feed children at school to make sure that it's healthy food, that it's nutritionally complete. And for character, I think an interesting example is arguments against free lunch. So every once in a while, people introduce bills to make it universally a free program. And politicians will say, well, no, that's bad because you are robbing children of the ability to have parents make them food. I almost have the name of the senator that said this. I'll tell you during Q&A, it'll occur to me, that it's such a tragedy to see kids, have to get free lunches. What's nice is to open up this bag that your mom, always mom, packed for you, that shows that she loves you, that has your favorite things in it, that we're stealing this by making an institutionally free thing, because I know parents would do it. So again, shaping character, making sure you're a good person. It's also, of course, support for farmers. So one of the kind of conflicts about what food to give kids is some people try to make it as local as possible. Should we support local farmers, or is it easier to, for example, here where I live down in South Texas, you can't grow apples, but you do want to give kids apples. We can talk about why that is in the Q&A, why we focus on apples as the fruit of all fruits, but that means supporting farther away farmers, and that's another conversation that they'll have. So in conclusion, one thing that this shows, I think, is that food is special. It does place a kind of moral demand. Even a country as cheap in how much social support we'll give to people, how much we want to say that, you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and it's kind of your own fault and that you're poor and I'm encouraging you to go get a job by punishing you in these various ways, we'll say that that's not the case for food, that it's a fundamental bedrock that you need in order to do well, and that we have these kinds of, we feel the call of hunger in others maybe differently. As I mentioned before, it's not just internal policy. US international policy is very much like this. We can talk in the Q&A if you're interested to think about food dumping, where we subsidize farmers by buying huge amounts of agricultural commodities and then give them to countries that are suffering from famine, even though that places those farmers in those countries out of business, sort of upsetting the balance in that country, whether accidentally or on purpose. We can talk about that. But then I just want to end by thinking about what can we do about this, right? So how could we make these programs better? Or how can we make social programs better in the United States? One possibility is to sort of accept the way that it is and try to make piecemeal, imminent critiques to improve these programs. One of them is to expand it, of course. As I've said, a lot of people have argued that we ought to expand school lunches to everybody. So, all children that go to public schools, just like they have access to dry erase markers and desks and school buses, which cost quite a lot of money, the fuel for school buses, which are all free services, should also have free food. And SNAP benefits, you can say that the income requirement ought to be less important, that you can make more money and still be able to qualify for SNAP, all things like that. Another issue is diversification. So diversification in a lot of different senses. One of them is that the food that is provided is in a particular sort of model of food. So there's been some work done in Michigan to try to make more culturally appropriate food available for children. Speaking of expansion, a lot of the programs will try to give breakfast as well as lunch, and breakfast and lunch, and maybe even dinner that you take home if you're a kid, so that we're feeding them for all 3 meals. But then those programs have done some interesting work about thinking about making sure people eat culturally appropriate food, and just, being cognizant of the fact that, for example, some people are lactose intolerant or gluten sensitive, and so that food provided ought to be more diverse. The other direction to go is to abandon this kind of food aid and replace it with aid, just money. There are a few things standing in the way of this. One of them is, and I think it's actually quite interesting. I could have spent the entire 30 minutes talking about this, but Americans, and I think humans in general, have a very poor understanding of fungibility. So it is the case that people, unless they had literally $0, would have used some of the very small amount of money they had for food. If you give them free food or money for food, then they will use some of that money for other things. And so the way money works is it's fully fungible. If you give people money, some of it will go to food and some will go to non-food. It doesn't matter. Like you're not actually just giving people food. by giving people food, you are still giving them money that they can use for other things or bad things like alcohol, cigarettes, whatever, or paying their rent, putting gas in their vehicle, things like that. So you need to overcome the fact that people say, well, hungry people should get food, and not just realize that impoverished people need support. Don't worry, some of it will be food. Nobody starves to death if you give them enough income. Another issue, of course, is inertia. As I was saying, there's a lot of political reasons, and it's just very hard to say we ought to cut food programs and give instead cash. You know, it's a difficult move twice. Cutting food programs terrifies people who are trying to help low income and marginalized communities, and giving cash other groups of people that object to. And then again, as I said, you know, that sort of a push for agrarianism. We want to think of ourselves as feeding the world. I mean, it's a phrase that Americans and American farmers, politicians use quite a lot. And so the idea of feeding the world includes giving food, right? And so saying, no, actually, we're an economic powerhouse, let's give money to the world, doesn't have the same sort of emotional resonance. Thank you very much.